Good afternoon, boys and girls. We're going to read another chapter of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And before we start, let's think about what children remain and what happened to the other ones that aren't there. So remember, Violet Beauregard turned into a blueberry. Augustus Gloop got sucked into the pipe. So the children that remain now, we have our main character, Charlie Bucket, and we know he's a good boy. He's poor. He always listens, though. And we have Veruca Salt, and she's a spoiled little brat, right? Remember talking about that. And then we have Mike TV, and of course he loves TV. So before I start reading, think about why the other children disappeared. What did they do that got them in trouble? And if I think back, I remember they did not listen to Mr. Willy Wonka. They did not follow directions, they did not listen, and they paid the price. So, now we're going to read chapter 24, Veruca in the Nut Room. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. The Nut Room, it said on the next door they came to. "All right," said Mr. Wonka, "stop here for a moment and catch your breath and take a peek through the glass panel of this door. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go in. The Nut Room. If you go in, you'll disturb the squirrels." Everyone crowded around the door. "Oh, look, Grandpa, look," cried Charlie. "Squirrels!" shouted Veruca Salt. "Jeepers," said Mike TV. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools around a large table. On the table, there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were all working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at a tremendous speed. "These squirrels are especially trained for getting the nuts out of walnuts," Mr. Wonka explained. "Why use squirrels?" Mike TV asked. "Why not use Oompa Loompas?" "Because," said Mr. Wonka, "Oompa Loompas can't get walnuts out of walnut shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of walnut shells every time. It is extremely difficult. But in my factory, I insist upon using only whole walnuts. Therefore, I have to have squirrels do the job. Aren't they wonderful, the way they get those nuts out? And see how they first tap each nut with their knuckles, just to be sure it's not a bad one. If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the garbage chute. There, look. Watch that squirrel nearest to us. I think he's got a bad one now." See if you can see this little picture of the squirrel. He's testing the nuts. So Mr. Wonka has Oompa Loompas working for him. He's got candies with faces. And he also has squirrels working for him. And what do the squirrels do? They open up the walnuts. How do they do it? They tap on each one, make sure it's not bad. And why does he have squirrels open the walnuts? Well, he told us they're the only animals that can get the walnut out whole. Oompa Loompas always break them. They watched the little squirrel as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckles. He cocked his head to one side, listening intently. Then suddenly he threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. "Hey, Mommy," shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. "I've decided I want a squirrel. Get me one of those squirrels." "Don't be silly, sweetheart," said Mrs. Salt. "These all belong to Mr. Wonka." "I don't care about that," shouted Veruca. "I want one. All I've got at home are 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 bunny rabbits and 2 parakeets and 3 canaries and a green parrot and a turtle and a bowl of goldfish and a cage of white mice and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel." "All right, my pet," said Mrs. Salt soothingly. "Mommy will get you a squirrel just as soon as she can." "But I don't want any squirrel," Veruca shouted. "I want a trained squirrel." At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. "Very well, Wonka," he said importantly, taking out his wallet full of money. "How much do you want for one of these crazy squirrels? Name your price." "They're not for sale," Mr. Wonka answered. "She can't have one." "Who says I can't?" shouted Veruca. "I'm going in to grab a squirrel this very minute." "Don't," said Mr. Wonka quickly, but he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with small black beady eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. Did Veruca listen? What was the direction? You cannot go in the room. She did not listen. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in his paws. "All right," Veruca said, "I want you." She reached out her hands to grab the squirrel, but as she did so, in that first split second when her hands started to go forward, there was a sudden flash of movement in the room, like a flash of brown lightning, and every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap towards her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 more caught hold of her left arm and pinned it down. 25 caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground. 24 caught hold of her left leg. And the one remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up onto her shoulder and started tapping the wretched girl's head with its knuckles. "Save her!" screamed Mrs. Salt. "Veruca, come back! What are they doing to her?" "They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut," said Mr. Wonka. "You watch." Veruca struggled ferociously, but the squirrels held her tight and she couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder went tapping the side of her head with his knuckles. Then, all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. "My goodness, she is a bad nut after all," said Mr. Wonka. "Her head must have sounded quite hollow." Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny, strong paws held her tightly and she couldn't escape. "Where are they taking her?" shrieked Mrs. Salt. "She's going where all the other bad nuts go," said Mr. Willy Wonka. "Down the garbage chute." "By golly, she is going down the garbage chute," said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. "Then save her!" cried Mrs. Salt. "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "She's gone." And indeed she had. "But where?" shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. "What happens to the bad nuts? Where does the chute go?" "That particular chute," Mr. Wonka told her, "runs directly into the great big main garbage pipe which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory. All the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotten cabbages and fish heads and stuff like that." "Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory, I'd like to know," said Mike TV. "I do, of course," answered Mr. Wonka. "You don't think I live on cocoa beans, do you?" But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, "where does the great big pipe go in the end?" "Why, to the furnace, of course," Mr. Wonka said calmly. "To the incinerator." Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. "Don't worry," said Mr. Wonka. "There's always a chance that they've decided not to light it today." "A chance!" yelled Mrs. Salt. "My darling Veruca, she'll be sizzled like a sausage." "Quite right, my dear," said Mr. Salt. "Now see here, Wonka," he added, "I think you've gone just a shade too far this time. I do indeed. My daughter may be a bit of a frump. I don't mind admitting it, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this. I really am." "Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka. "I expect she'll turn up again sooner or later. She may not even have gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole, and if that's the case, all you'll have to do is go in and pull her up again." Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. "Veruca!" shouted Mrs. Salt. "Are you down there?" There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further forward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny little push, one gentle nudge in the right place, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled into the hole head first, screeching like a parrot. "Good gracious me," said Mr. Salt as he watched his fat wife go tumbling down the hole. "What a lot of garbage there's going to be today." He saw her disappear into the darkness. "What's it like down there, Angina?" he called out. He leaned further forward. And here's a couple of pictures. I have a lot of thoughts about what's going on now. Here is Mrs. Salt. There's Mr. Salt. And then there's Mr. Salt yelling down the hole. Now, I'm surprised Mr. Salt isn't as upset that his wife and his daughter just disappeared down this hole and may be incinerated. And to be incinerated means to be burnt up. You incinerate garbage. Mr. Salt doesn't seem that concerned about it, so I don't think I like him very much. The squirrels rushed up behind him. "Help!" he shouted, but he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him, and his daughter. "Oh dear," cried Charlie, who was watching with the others through the door. "What on earth is going to happen to them now?" "I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute," said Mr. Wonka. "But what about the great fiery incinerator?" asked Charlie. They only light it every other day," said Mr. Wonka. "Perhaps this is one of the days when they let it go out. You never know. They might be lucky." "Shh," said Grandpa Joe. "Listen. Here comes another song." From far away down the corridor came the beating of the drums. And then the singing began. "Oompa Loompa, I will not sing the song." It's a very long song, but the Oompa Loompas sing the song and take away Veruca Salt and talk about how she disappeared with her parents. And that is the end of our chapter. So, this is getting crazier by the chapter. Now, how many children remain? Charlie and Mike TV. Can you make a prediction about what might happen to the 2 remaining children? Don't make a prediction if you already saw the movie. Obviously, that would give it away. But there's a lot going on. I think these 2 children could be in trouble. I would be nervous if I was them, and I wonder how you're feeling. So, tune in tomorrow for another chapter of Charlie. Have a good afternoon.